Special Counsel's probe looming over his presidency, Donald Trump today resumed his attacks on the investigation after a brief two-day hiatus. Resorting to his usual talking points, Trump made the unfounded claim on Twitter that without the phony Russia witch hunt, my approval rating would be at 75%. What's called presidential harassment, he said. Now we're learning that Trump's impulsive Twitter habit may be his only line of defense against the reckoning that may soon come. That's because The Atlantic is today reporting that there's no strategy for how to deal with any upcoming revelations from the special counsel's office. In fact, the Trump White House is all but winging it. Quote, according to a half dozen current and former White House officials, the administration has no plans in place for responding to the special counsel's findings, save for expecting a Twitter spree. Remember Giuliani's claim last August that he was drafting a counter report to discredit the results of the investigation? Giuliani now says he hasn't drafted anything. Well, according to The Atlantic, Giuliani said it's been difficult in the past few months to even consider drafting response plans or devote time to the counter report. White House sources also say they recognize the, quote, futility of drafting a strategy that Trump will likely ignore anyway, close quote. Well, part of the problem, according to one former Trump official, is that any attempt to plan ahead, quote, would mean you would have to have an honest conversation about what might be coming. Well, some potential revelations could come from Mueller's office as early as tomorrow. That's because we're expecting sentencing memos to be filed on the case of, this is a big one, Michael Cohen, who has actively cooperated with the special counsel, and Paul Manafort, who has broken his plea agreement by lying to investigators. It means that we could learn about the information that each witness has given to or withheld from Mueller's prosecutions. That's tomorrow. Joining me right now is Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell, who sits on the House Intelligence Committee. Heidi Presbla, national political reporter for the NBC News, and Chuck Rosenberg is a former U.S. attorney and former senior FBI official. Thank you. I'll go to Congressman Swalwell about this thing now. What do you make of the fact that the Trump team, according to reporting by The Atlantic, they don't have a defense? Rudy Giuliani was BSing weeks ago when he said, we're putting together a big counter report. We're going to come out with a report to match Mueller's report. Now they're saying, we don't have nothing. We're going to play shortstop on this, just see which way the ball hops.
Good evening, Chris. How do you prepare somebody who's a stranger to the truth for what's about to come? And of course, there's no way to defend him. He will take his own course. He will continue to obstruct, tamper, and try and influence the investigation. But here's where his staff should be prepared, because the president calls it presidential harassment, but it's really just the end of the presidential immunity that he's enjoyed. So there are going to be subpoenas coming his way to the White House, to the Trump organization. There's going to be a call for witnesses who came in and gave us a bunch of BS stories to actually be straight with us or be held in contempt of Congress. And there's going to be an effort to want to know if the White House is willing to finally come clean about what happened. So this isn't going away. They can't just wish this away. The American people gave us 40 new members of Congress to put a balance of power on all of these abuses of power.
What do you make, just to make that point of your last one, give you a chance to make it. We've had Mueller going after this guy for a long time now. Mueller's working. I call him the iceberg because you don't know what he's got, but he's going to hit hard when he hits. And the Titanic could well sink, as it did in history. But here's the question. How does Congress make this a stronger assault on Trump's definition of the truth or his lack of dealing with the truth? Why is Congress jumping on here matter? Help me.
Because we have a presidential election in 2020, and we were attacked in the last one. And if we can't weather another attack like we had in 2016, a democracy can't survive. So if we're going to harden the ballot box and make sure the American people have the awareness they need, we have to know just who the president's team worked with in the past, how the Russians pulled this off, and then put reforms in place so it doesn't happen again. We are now much better able to do that. But that means taking an MRI to everything the Trump team did with the Russians and perhaps also the Saudis. It looks like they were open for business with anyone that wanted to help them. But it's our democracy that's at stake. This isn't about one person. It's about whether the rule of law and free and fair elections will still persist in our country.
Heidi, two related questions. Does Trump know what's coming from Mueller? And secondly, has he prepared his team of lawyers to defend him?
He may have some sense of it because according to that Atlantic reporting, according to Giuliani himself, it took 3 weeks for the president to answer a series of questions that should have taken 2 days. Part of the problem that he's facing also is simply a staffing issue. First of all, his chief counsel on this has been held up by some kind of a security clearance problem after Don McGahn left. And secondly, think about it from the staff's perspective, Chris. Either you are a staff member who yourself may have legal exposure, or you're a staff member who doesn't want to have that legal exposure. And so he's surrounded by people who aren't talking straight to him as well, and people who believe that even if they do, he's not going to listen to them anyway. He's going to ignore them, do his own thing on Twitter.
Anyway, as Heidi mentioned, Rudy Giuliani also suggested the president had some difficulty answering those written questions posed by Mueller's team. As Giuliani told The Atlantic, answering those questions was a nightmare. It took him about 3 weeks to do what would have normally taken 2 days. Wow, this comes a month after the president made a point of saying he personally answered the questions very easily. Let's listen.
My lawyers aren't working on that. I'm working on that. I write the answers. My lawyers don't write answers. I write answers. I was asked a series of questions. I've answered them very easily. Very easily.
Chuck, when does self-delusion hit the floor?
Well, fair question. You know, Heidi made this point and the congressman made this point. The president seems to have some trouble with the truth. What any good lawyer needs to be an effective good lawyer is a complete unvarnished truth from their client. Without that, it's going to be very hard to push back on anything that prosecutors do or on any report that's written.
Well, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Doesn't the client, I don't know how this is done sometimes, because when somebody who's really guilty of a murder, for example, they don't run in and tell their lawyer, I did it. So I'm told. So does Trump, he doesn't tell everybody I was working with the Russians or I obstructed justice. He's not going to tell that to a lawyer, is he?
Well,
is that illegal what I did? I mean, is he going to actually have that conversation?
Well, should he have that conversation? Absolutely. Will he? In my experience, Chris, as a prosecutor, defense attorneys, very good defense attorneys, often learn more about what their client did from me, the prosecutor, than from their own client. And that's unfortunate. Yeah. Because no matter what it is you did, if you want someone to mitigate it for you, right, if you want someone to make a bad situation as good as you possibly can, you have to tell them the truth.
But do criminals tell their lawyers they did it?
Some do, most don't.
Yeah, anyway, The Atlantic also reports that according to congressional sources, there's been little communication between the White House and the president's Republican allies in Congress. According to a senior Republican aide, we haven't heard from the White House at all on this. You'd think there'd be more of an effort to have a coordinated response. Members want to help, but can't if they're not getting information. Congressman, I know you're on the other side of the aisle. Do you get any sense that there's Republicans out there working hand in glove to help this president save himself? And I ask that because 89% of Republican voters are still with this Republican president. So I wonder whether Republican members are with him or not.
I'm afraid to see what Republican colleagues of mine would do if they did have a line of communication, because what I see underground in the House Intelligence Committee and above ground in the House Judiciary Committee is an effort at almost every stop to protect the president. At many points, it's actually obstructing. So I have a hard time believing that's true. We've had witnesses come in before the House Intelligence Committee who were feeding back. Their lawyers told us that they were feeding back our questions to the White House. It seems like they're well aligned, so I don't necessarily buy that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.